Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this is the Meaning of Catholic. Right now, the studio in New Orleans for the Crusade channel, where we usually have the Kennedy profession, that studio is right now out of commission. And the reason for that is because of the hurricane that happened down in New Orleans, the area down there in Louisiana. That's the area where the Crusade channel is located. So right now, the station is out of commission. The station is fine as far as I can tell, infrastructure and so forth. However, there is no access to the services that are necessary to run the station: internet, cable, electricity, and so forth. So the station is having some problems. So right now, Mike Church is trying to find a way to make a remote studio. Hopefully, we'll be back on air tomorrow. If you are joining us, thank you for coming on to the live stream. This is a free preview of the Kennedy profession. And we're going to talk about something today that I was going to talk about on my radio show, but it's not on today because of the hurricane that took out the studio capabilities down in New Orleans. And by the way, if you could, if one way you can help out the station, considering that there's been some problems because of the hurricane, if you go to crusadechannel.com/Kennedy, you can sign up. That helps us to pay for the costs that keep the station going. With the hurricane situation, there's going to be costs like there are with all natural disasters. And every little bit helps. And if you go to shop.mikechurch.com, you can find a crowdfunding initiative as well. I'll put something in the link of the show notes before I leave. So what I want to talk about today is something I'm going to have to talk about strategically. And this is the Meaning of Catholic channel that we're on right now. But this sort of thing has to do with the Catholic faith, even though it's not specifically a Catholic issue. We're going to talk about the modern day cult that we're living through. And I don't use that word lightly. The word cult should be defined. If you read history books or theology books, you might see the word cult as a technical term, i.e., we are in the cultus. We're in the cult of the Christian faith. You're in the cult of the, pagan belief or whatever it is. These things are interchangeable. Today, when we use the word cult, it's a pejorative term. We use it to basically signify that someone believes something that basically governs every aspect of their life and is ultimately harmful to that person. Atheists would call me, as a traditional Catholic, if I live my life that way, they'd say, "Oh, you've joined a cult," because they think it's bad. That's not the proper usage, but that's the way we use the word. If I, as a Catholic, thought that somebody had joined, the cult of the respiratory illness that we shall not name so that this video does not get flagged. That's one of the benefits, by the way, of being on the radio, is we can talk about these things without getting flagged. So crusadechannel.com/Kennedy to sign up. Now, in any case, we're going to talk about this cult that we're living through, and we're going to use that popular conception of the term. There's a great article. It's called The COVID Cult's Attack on Science and Society. It's from an institute called the Brownstone Institute. If you don't know what the Brownstone Institute is, in my opinion, it's one of the best places for information commentary, not just stats. They've good stats, but commentary on what's going on with the whole narrative of public health that we're living through. The gentleman who started it is actually named Jeffrey Tucker. He himself, I believe, is actually a traditional Catholic, although it's not a religious apostolate or anything like that. He takes sort of a classic liberal financial position. I think he's a Mises sort of disciple. He did at one point run the New Liturgical Movement publication. And since then, he's moved on to do other things as well. He sort of mainly works in the realm of public finance and economics and so forth. Oh, somebody's joining me in my studio here. Who is that? Who is that? Come on in. Whose feet are those? Hi, Clover. Oh, this is Clover. She's wearing her princess costume. Say hello. Hi. Okay, sweetie, I'm on the show. You got to go. Okay. Anyway, home studio. Now, in any case, it's a great article. They have great stuff there. It's the best sort of secular resource I've found for commentary from a public health and a public policy perspective. So this article that I've got is called The COVID Cult's Attack on Science and Society. Go on, sweetie. Get, please. And He starts it off by saying, and it's not him who wrote this, but this is his organization. It's written by a man named Roger Coops, who's a retired PhD in something or other that has to do with chemistry, biology, and so forth. All the things you need to know to understand this stuff. And he says, my compliments to members of the COVID cult. Look at what they've been able to accomplish by instilling such universal panic over a common respiratory virus that appears to have a comparable overall mortality risk as influenza with a strong age gradient. This was especially amazing since the virus had already been well disseminated throughout the world without revealing anything about which to be panicked before suddenly the cult seized power. We can all remember that fateful time, March 2020. And it went from normal life to this. Some people are lucky enough to live in a place where they've basically recaptured some sort of normalcy. And many places look like that's going to remain. Thanks be to God. I live in a place where we haven't recaptured much sense of normalcy. And barring some sort of miracle, I don't think we're going to be getting it back anytime soon. So this is of particular interest to me. He talks about the fact that this whole narrative was able to tap into the deep well of totalitarian inclinations of politicians. That's an interesting statement. You have to understand, we've been told that we live in this age of democracy. The idea is that we live in an age where democratic rule rules the day. Well, the problem is democratic rule doesn't necessarily mean democratic rule. Democratic rule in the mind of most people, especially the godless, the materialists and so forth, who are generally speaking in charge, or at least influence those in charge, that just means the majority rule. Public opinion is democracy. I remember a few years ago, former Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, who was a pretty decent Prime Minister, pretty conservative, Christian, outspoken about some of those things. And there was a gentleman out in Western Canada who had his car painted in a way where it said F-U-C-K Harper. He was the Prime Minister. And the local police, basically, the local bylaw basically said you can't have that for reasons of public obscenity. You know, the same reasons you can't put it on a billboard. You just can't drive around with that. And he basically said, well, this is an issue. This is against democracy. See, this guy, because there was an anti-prime minister movement, there was a movement against this gentleman. There was this idea that because people don't like this guy and a lot of people support me, therefore I ought to be able to do it because that's democracy. That's not democracy. In the purest sense, democracy is nothing like that. That's just mob rule. And that's what most people believe. So this is what happened. They tapped into the totalitarian inclinations of politicians. All politicians today, well, not all, many politicians today have that. Because most politicians today believe that a poll constitutes some sort of truth. Perhaps you remember some of the interviews and things like that you'll see with politicians running for office, and they'll say, well, what are you going to do about hospital something or other? What are you going to do about the electricity or green energy or whatever it is? And they'll say, well, polls tell us. Polls don't mean anything if it's not true. You could have 1,000 people believing a wrong thing and it's still wrong. It doesn't matter that they believe it. He goes on to say they were able to enlist very effectively most major media in most countries as sources of propaganda and brainwashing. This is true. This is especially true in the country of Canada. It's especially true. There is not a single disseminating media outlet about this at all. At best, we have one newspaper called the National Post, which is sort of a watered-down Wall Street Journal, which is not saying much considering the Wall Street Journal in many ways is also watered down. There doesn't exist a newspaper. There's the Toronto Sun is okay. It's a poor man's version of the New York Post. They'll criticize, but the problem is the Toronto Sun is a partisan Conservative Party newspaper. And the Conservative Party has gone all in on lockdown ideology for the most part. So any criticism of the lockdown has been tempered by the fact that they can't go too much after their own guys. So there's nothing really here in the mainstream that does it. And in fact, it's almost impossible to get an actual right-wing station. I mean, Fox News, for example, has its problems, but Fox News is loads better than anything that we have here in Canada. So if you're looking for information about what's happening here from a local perspective, as a Canadian, you don't get it. So when it comes time to show someone, for example, which has been so maddening, we actually called our local politicians and said, we need a better approach. And we'll talk to the local politician and he'll say, well, all the networks are saying this and all the statistics in our country are saying this. And we'll say, well, have you heard of Florida? Have you heard of South Dakota? Have you heard of whatever? Well, immediately that turns into, oh, you're talking about Fox News? That crazy American station? There doesn't exist. I mean, it would help if there was an option in Canada, but there's not. Someone's coming to visit me again. Home office issues. In any case, he says they were able to enlist technology companies as sources of censorship and mind control. I like the fact that he says mind control and not just as sources of censorship. This is true. Not just sources of censorship, but also sources of mind control. We need to tease that out for just half a second here. What do you think your smartphone is? Do you think your smartphone is just a device you use, or is it a device that uses you? Because they're not necessarily the same thing. See, I downgraded to this phone. It's called a light phone. It's just basically looks like, I don't know, a tiny Game Boy or something. It has data, so I can use it as a hotspot if I need to use my computer on the road to do emails or articles or something. But it has no browser, it has no social media, etc. The reason I got it is because our phones take over our lives. Unless you have some sort of real severe form of self-control, and I'm not talking about just self-control, like, I'm not saying that everyone who picks up a smartphone will obviously fall into some sort of degenerate habit. That's not what I'm saying. Many people can, I would hope many people listening to this, a pious Christian man could stop themselves from that sort of activity. I think that's the case. I know that's not the case in the population at large. But how often do you spend on your phone? Think about how much time you spend on your phone reading things on social media or browsers or YouTube or whatever you do that reaffirm what you already know. Now, there's nothing wrong with reaffirming things in the face of new obstacles, but it becomes a constant drip where you need to reaffirm what you already know. And that's not necessarily a good thing. If you know the right thing, at least it's helpful in that regard, insofar as you're not brainwashing yourself into the point where you're living in a fantasy world. But if you think about the onslaught, what's happened to people. I saw a gentleman walking down the street a couple days ago wearing a mask outside in hot weather. Not a very healthy guy, sort of your average overweight, middle-aged guy, maybe in his 50s. And he was wearing a t-shirt that said, "True North, strong and free." That's the motto of Canada. It's in our national anthem, one of the mottos. He said he was free. His t-shirt said he was free. He was wearing a mask outside and evading children and people walking their dogs on the sidewalks because he was scared of them. That doesn't happen because someone is scared of a virus. That happens because someone is beaten into submission by the media that they don't stop consuming. It's a mass psychosis that has happened to people. It's a psychosis of what happens when you go into a psychosis. And this has been demonstrated. There's actually an interesting video on that. I think it's called something about how to make a mass psychosis. I can't remember. It's gone pretty viral on YouTube, a few million views. The person who made it definitely is not, in my opinion, well versed in Christendom or Middle Ages or medieval theology or history. It's sort of got some annoying liberal talking points, but he nails it as far as understanding a psychosis is concerned. You see, when somebody has a psychotic break and they experience a psychosis, it doesn't mean that they become nuts. This person says, "This is why I keep the TV off." Bravo. We actually don't have cable, and we're probably getting rid of our TV soon. We've kept it for some old movies and old shows, but we're probably just going to get rid of it. Not worth it. In any case, when someone has a psychotic break, it doesn't mean that they become what we consider like a quote-unquote crazy person. They don't start walking down the street telling everybody about the alien invasion that they're in their room in the middle of the night. That's not what happens. That's something else. A psychotic break basically means that someone is overloaded with negative emotion. This is why it's a brainwashing technique. This is why law enforcement organizations like the ones that deal in international diplomacy, et cetera, like that. This is why they can basically break someone's brain and brainwash them by making them have an overload on negative emotions. So they can keep the lights on for a very long time. They can play loud music. They can waterboard them. They can, they could do a million different things. They could hurt them for a long time. But the point is, it's a consistent implementation of negative emotion that causes a person to break. So once you've broken, what do? Once you basically have broken down and you've decided that living in reality is too difficult, what do you need? You need a remedy. You need a security blanket. You need to be told a story that makes you feel better about yourself. Now, atheists will say that's what religion is. That's not true, because religion does not get rid of your negative emotion necessarily, because it's very difficult. It should bring you peace and the true religion, but that's another story. But when you break someone down, they need to find something that gives them comfort. And the more fantastical or out of this world or wacky the threat that you've given them, the more extreme the remedy could be. It's kind of like that idea. It's not a true idea, but it's that people will say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That's not necessarily true, but there's a reality that makes that attractive, because it is true. I mean, if something incredible were to happen, you would hope you would have some sort of incredible way of seeing people, or of seeing it. Now, someone asked in the chat, is this like what the USA does at Guantanamo Bay? I don't know. I don't know what goes on there. I would imagine that it's not necessarily, I don't know. See, the problem is, if you understand human psychology, we're talking about, is a psychotic break like what they try to do at Guantanamo Bay? I don't know. I don't know if that'd be useful. In all seriousness, if you actually understand the mechanism of what it means to have a psychotic break and put somebody in a form of psychosis, then if you really understand that, you realize that you won't actually get accurate information, because the person breaks from reality and then invents a way of living, or accepts a fictitious way of life in order to cope with what is too difficult for them to accept. So I don't know. I would say probably not. I mean, I'm not saying that they don't torture people, but I don't know if they would want to push the person to a psychotic break, because I think that would work against their own desires. I mean, if you want to get true information, you've got to have this fine line of pushing someone to their breaking point, but not pushing them to the point where they don't continue to understand reality, because they'll give you false information. So I have no idea. what they do at Guantanamo Bay. So he continues in the article and he says, they were able to enlist corporations to walk lockstep with you, and they have profited from it. I was talking to a stockbroker, major successful stockbroker in the Canadian stock market. And he said, this has been one of the most lucrative years for men in his position. He hates to say it. It really has been a time where the wealthy have gotten much wealthier. You can look at everything from housing prices to prices of lumber. And you might think, what does the prices of lumber have to do with rich getting richer? Well, it has to do with the prices of houses going up because of the costs of houses and so forth. I mean, there's lots of reasons for that. But essentially, people that deal with big money got big returns on big money. Okay. Couple that with the fact that there's been massive inflation. Well, who does inflation hurt the most? Inflation hurts the poor. Public or major corporations have made a massive profit. Also, think how much time you've spent online ordering things. Perhaps you've even made ordering things your new normal. I hate to use that term. I know that in many ways, as much as I want to support local stores around here, depending on where you go, are still lockdown crazy. Even the government says you don't have to be. They just don't want to let it go. So you just don't want to shop there, and you end up going to Amazon. Major corporations have made a lot of money. They were also able to enlist public health agencies. Now, public health agencies operate on a very damnable thesis. There's a doctor named Dr. Ashley Fernandez. He's on a recent podcast that I was listening to by Trish Wood. She's a Canadian reporter. She used to host a show that's called The Fifth Estate. It was like Canada's 60 Minutes. She was a legacy journalist, but she was always pretty decent. She has since sort of become she calls herself a politically homeless, small L libertarian, sort of doesn't know what she is, but wants to ask a lot of questions. So she's been great on lockdowns, which has been wonderful, and is a great show. And she had this guy on, Dr. Ashley Fernandez, who is from the Ohio area, if I'm not mistaken. And he's a medical ethicist. People don't really understand this, okay? Public health is not the same thing as medicine. Public health operates on a principle of what's called, quote unquote, the greater good. It's a very Marxist enterprise. That's not to say that there's not any need for public health, technically speaking. I think there's very little need for it. But generally speaking, public health is supposed to make decisions about okay, you've got 10,000 people in a community. There's some sort of problem with some sort of sickness. What's the best way we can operate now in order to have the least amount of harm? That's pretty much their job. Now, they're materialist. That's the way their work works. This is why when you put public health people in charge and nobody else calls them on their baloney, then you get these endless lockdowns, which obviously cause somebody says, sounds like Kennedy has the sniffles. It's called allergies. But yes, I will self-quarantine in a corner in the fetal position. There you go. But yes, so public health operate on this greater good philosophy. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, technically speaking. But if you have that philosophy as it's, there's always an element where when you're thinking about the common good, you will have to make some tough decisions. If you had I remember reading about St. Charles Borromeo ordering in Milan, basically, this was during one of the major plagues. I believe it was typhus, which is actually quite deadly. And basically, he ordered that, if you were sick, you would just lock the doors and stay home, and hopefully you survived. I mean, it was a really tough decision to make, but it was that deadly. It was that harmful. It was that awful. There was something like a lockdown to it, but it was obviously shorter, more severe, and so on and so forth. Anyway, there's not necessarily anything wrong with looking at the collective and trying to make a decision. But you have to temper that by understanding the personal reality of individual people, unique human persons. Public health people are not trained in that. They're not. This is why, you can have these people standing on podiums on, doing their press conferences about whatever case is rising every day or something like that. And it's almost like when they're talking about these things, they're emotionless. It reminds me of Jaws when he talks about, he's got doll's eyes. There's something about it where you go, don't you have a conscience? I mean, don't the stories of rising suicides bother you? I don't know if they do, but they don't in a professional sense, because they go, well, we were told X, Y, and Z, so we would have more deaths. People killing themselves is sad, but it's about numbers. It's a consequentialist morality all the way through. There is no concept of real ethics. This goes down, for example, to why so many church leaders are completely wrong right now, completely wrong about the jab being an act of charity. It's impossible that this thing be an act of charity. The reason being, not because, medicine in and of itself cannot really be an act of charity, because medicine in and of itself has to be a personal decision that you make as an informed person about what risks you're willing or not willing to take. And those reasons are unique to you. That's what it always has to be. I don't care if it's an experimental vaccine or this one, or like this one, or a tried and true. One of the great things about this article that I found, the author actually puts a chart about the different types of immunity that you get, natural immunity, NAI, naturally acquired immunity. And he talks about it as historically it's been understood to be a superior form of immunity. So, for example, even with smallpox, if you get it and don't die, your immunity is actually superior to the inoculation. It's a lifetime, not 12 to 15 years. What does this person say? The jab is an act of selfishness. Well, I mean, it doesn't keep you from getting it or passing on, supposedly keeps you from getting sick. I wouldn't say that I'm not a fan of this one. I work for LifeSite. You probably know what I believe about it. It's silly. It's dangerous. So I wouldn't get it. I don't know if I would say getting something that protects you is necessarily selfish. I'm just saying it's not selfless. Chickenpox, lifetime immunity if you get it. Polio, lifetime if you... Now, these are very serious. I'm not saying I want you to go get polio. But there are ways of contracting viruses without getting sick. This is something that hasn't been talked about since this whole thing started, is the whole conversation about what's ethical and what's not ethical. Anyway, the reason why it hasn't happened and why people haven't been allowed to make their own decisions is because we have only a public health We only have a public health approach to this. We don't have an ethical or it's not even a medical approach. It's a public health approach. If you talk to a good doctor, they will tell you, for example, that stress levels are bad for their patients. They know this. I talked to a doctor one time who was not a religious man, but he really appreciated the effects of religious staff. He was just being very general with it, but coming into whoever was treating at the hospital, because it helped the person heal faster because it relaxed them. So we should probably go back to that idea I was talking about. By the way, if you're just joining us, thank you. The Crusade Channel station is down because of the hurricane in New Orleans. The station will be fine, but it's going to take some work. Everyone's safe. So we're streaming here today on Meaning a Catholic, a little extra long. If you're enjoying it and you want to hear more of this, I've got to temper my words a little bit because I'm on YouTube. Certain things I'd like to say, I say them on the radio all the time. If you want to hear more, go to crusadechannel.com/Kennedy. In fact, I can actually put I can put it in the chat here. crusadechannel.com/chat or Kennedy. Sorry. Chat is the chat room. In any case, so we've had a completely public health approach. So what they've been able to do is they've been able to frighten people into believing that some porous covering on their face could actually stop a virus. Can you breathe through that thing that you wear over your face that they make you wear at the grocery store? What do you think is going to happen? What does a respiratory mean? Right? Breathing. How do you think a respiratory thing will pass to your respiratory system? Probably through breathing. If you can breathe through something, you think it's going to stop a breathing thing? I doubt it. I've heard from one doctor that at best it's like throwing sand at a chain link fence. It's not a thing, people. It doesn't do anything. Face coverings have been used primarily for bacteria. When you're doing surgery, my wife has had 4 C-sections. I wear a mask when I go into the operation room, the delivery room. They don't want you to have any spittle or something like that comes out that has some sort of bacteria. That's for wounds and things like that. That makes total sense. But it's not about catching a cold. It doesn't do anything. At best, when if you have a bacterial pneumonia or something, and there's something to do with the stuff that you might cough up, it might catch some of that sort of stuff. But that's not what this is. And even then, you got to be symptomatic and all that sort of stuff. So you know the deal. You probably know the deal. But the point is, this public health response, which has frightened people, they've accepted so many different things that are indicative of being in a cult. Okay? Meaning they accept things because of this mass psychosis, this psychotic break of society. And the reason it's been a mass psychosis is because of these smartphones, because of the inundation with this news media all the time, pushing you to the point where you think that, you're like in the story of Chicken Little, and everything is on every station is telling you the sky is falling. And they're saying these are the only helmets that will work. And if you don't wear them, you're all going to die. If you continue to inundate yourself with that message, you'll start to believe it. And if you start to believe it, it's an apocalyptic approach. It's ironically very religious. We live in an atheistic culture, but it's like their own apocalyptic literature. And the only salvation is this unholy sacrament of the jab. And you have to wear the garment. You don't wear a scapular. Wear the cloth over your face, not over your heart. And he writes in here that people were told they'd be okay if they stood magical distances from each other. There's no evidence for this. That's been debunked since day one. Or that by splashing some alcohol in their hands, they would protect themselves. Or by erecting plexiglass between merchant and customer, the virus would be confounded. Or that by staying home and hiding, they would somehow be saved along with the rest of the planet. Likewise, they were able to convince these people that somehow, suddenly now, everyone that they knew or did not know posed a risk to them and should be avoided at all costs. They were also able to convince them that performing any act of humanity, such as enjoying music, attending meetings, socializing, enjoying specially prepared foods, going to schools, etc., would lead to the destruction of the human race. You don't accept this sort of thing unless you've had a break. I've seen this happen to people. I've seen it happen to people who at the beginning of this called nonsense on it in their gut. But place of work, maybe their church, because the bishops have been so bad on it for the most part. They just internalize it. Oh, somebody got sick. Maybe I was wrong the whole time. Ooh, this is really bad, as people think. He says they were able to pave the way for medication pharmaceutical companies to really profit. Think about this. The average earnings on an experimental drug, an approved drug after 1 year is a big success if it earns about $1 billion. Approved, like Advil. Okay. But one of these companies starts with a P, PFI. I won't say it because of YouTube. They reported over $30 billion in earnings just from the one unapproved inoculation. It wasn't approved yet. That was recent. And even that wasn't really an approval. People have been asking me, why do you think this happened? One of the gentlemen I think is really smart, David Martin. He was behind that. He's the patent legal expert that looks at the origins of these viruses and things. And he basically says, if I were to see I've said this before, if he walked by a bank and he saw a guy standing outside with a bag of money and basically the guy was holding a bag of money, wearing a ski mask, the alarm was off in the bank, and he was brandishing a gun, he'd say, well, I would think that guy wanted to steal from that bank. He might have reasons why he did it. He might have psychological problems. He might really have a bad problem with his mom. Who knows? I mean, we could psychologize the guy all the way, to the root of it. But the reality is he wanted to do that thing. That's why he did that thing. That's all we can know. He wanted to rob that bank. So therefore we look at, well, how did he rob that bank? And he did it. Why? To make a lot of money. Why did this happen? Someone in the chat says, because people aren't leading virtuous lives. Of course not. And there's an inordinately fearful of death. Yes. But insofar as why did the people that capitalized on it do it? Follow the money. We need to realize that what's happened the last 6 months, especially 8 months, they've instituted a new flu shot. That's what it is. And when I say flu shot intentionally, because the flu shot was never called, people might have called it a vaccine, but it was never really called a vaccine. Why? Because it didn't have any of the long-term immunity. Natural immunity to the flu gets you about a year. Best case literature from the flu shot says you get about a year, if you get it at all, depending if it gets the right strain. There's no such thing as a vaccine for a flu. It's not like a virus that you can isolate to the point where you can stop it in its tracks, at least theoretically. It doesn't work that way. I don't know how it works, but it's a different mechanism as far as what I can tell from reading literature. They've instituted a flu shot. $30 billion from just one of the companies in 1 year before it was even approved. How many people, let's just say best case scenario that we come out of this thing, things go back to a little bit of normal, which I think they do. I have reasons to believe that, not because I'm an optimist, but because I believe that everyone gets tired of everything. I believe it's untenable. I think it's a damnable thing that's happened, but I think at a certain point it kind of goes away. There'll be vestiges of it, but I think it just does, like everything else. Everything else goes away. And when it does, it won't be the same urgency that we have now. But just think about the continual customer base that you have. It's pretty remarkable, isn't it? Follow the money. Now, he goes on to say there's been some holdouts, of course. Think about the Floridas of the world, the South Dakotas, Sweden. In fact, lots of Africa. Much of Africa, in places where they're taking ivermectin. They've sort of opened up completely. But he says, like any good cult, they continue to send minions after them to try to castigate them. It's true. He says, I do not think their goal is to bring these renegades back into the fold, but is to serve as a warning to others that they may want, if they want to try to escape. This is like what you do if you've ever watched something on North Korea. I remember watching a documentary on North Korea, and the education of the kids was basically showing how evil the West was. So yeah, things are bad here, but if you go there, they like eat children, that kind of thing. The idea is of going after these freedom fighter places. It's, try to go against us and we'll come after you. If you want to not follow the narrative. This is cult-like behavior. He says, but as clever as they have been, none of it would have been possible if not for the public that was ripe to be had. Like any successful con, the audience had to first be conditioned. He says, here you may have had some luck because the conditioning has been going on for a long time. You had it easy. In 1996, Dr. Sagan bemoaned the ignorance of society in regards to science and technology during an interview with Charlie Rose just about 6 months before his death. Sagan understood that such ignorance could lead to easy manipulation by the people in power. At about the 3.5-minute mark, he said, sooner or later it will blow up in our faces. And Sagan predicted an explosion would occur. I'm not saying Carl Sagan was great on a lot of stuff, but he was an interesting thinker. But it's true. This wouldn't have happened unless we were open to it. You know what this started with? I was thinking about this the other day, or a month, I don't know. Sometime in the last 2 weeks, just slow the spread. Do you remember the ice bucket challenge? Does anyone in the chat, do you remember the ice bucket challenge? That thing was so dumb. Now, I'm not saying it didn't raise money for ALS or whatever. I'm just saying, like, fine. Anything that raises money for research for something that's bad, okay, great. I'm happy about that. But what happened with that? The idea was basically show your support for ALS research. If you don't donate, yeah, and in a handbasket in the chat says, yes, it was funny. It was funny, but I mean, it was conditioned us for this thing. Because what was it? It was, the idea was to donate to a good cause. Let's just say, let's agree, a good cause. Fine. I'm sure someone's going to message me at some point and say, did you know about the fraud? And I don't know. I'm just saying baseline. Raising money for helping sick people, I'm fine with. Okay. And, but the idea is that you had to raise the money to help. If you didn't, then you had to do one of the ice challenges. And someone says in the chat, it started as jumping in a lake, then an ice tub, then toned down to a bucket with ice water. But the point is if you didn't, like, you were shamed, basically, if you didn't do the whole ice thing. But then I remember watching these videos. I didn't have Instagram, but I saw somebody showed me or whatever. And it was, we really want to support ALS. So here's our pouring water on ourselves. Think about that for a sec. I mean, hey, I have wrote a book where, I recommend having cold showers as a discipline. Nothing wrong with cold therapy. But what's the mentality behind that? The mentality behind that is show that you're on the same team as everybody else about the cause that's been deemed politically correct by doing something to humiliate yourself. That's what that is. This is the logical conclusion of the ice bucket challenge, basically. Don't think about it. Don't think it through. Do what you're told by the public health narrative. And that's what that was. It was a health initiative for the public. I don't know if there was anyone behind it in a devious sense, but I'm just saying. This whole thing started with things like the ice bucket challenge. Think about what happened at the advent of this whole shenanigans. Within hours, I was astonished. Within hours, there was basically full-length poetry written with like animation, spreading across hundreds of thousands of views and dozens of them at a time. There was a children's book written like within a week. There was a full thing on it about to tell your kid that the world caught a cold. It was, as this author says, it was a declaration when they declared war on the virus. That's what this was. This was a war mentality. But because we don't have any virtue left in society, as flawed as the motivations behind various wars were, I'm not saying one way or the other it was good to start a war. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying there is virtue in a society that organizes itself behind something for self-sacrificial activity. That's a virtuous sentiment. That's a good thing to have that. Whether or not you're doing the right thing with the military, that's not the question. The question is whether or not what you're doing is virtuous. This was like that whole mobilization, but without any virtue. Because they declared war on something you can't fight. You can go fight them over there, overseas. You can do that technically because they're there. They're going to fight back. It's a level playing field. You can't fight a virus in a war sense. You can't. And think how illogical this thing has been, because what it did is it labeled true science misinformation. Now, I'm not a fan of modern science for the most part, but the one thing that I am a fan of is the method. Everyone who has a vested interest in legitimate scientific inquiry should be hoping or excited about the possibility of research that could disprove everything they believe about the virus, and that could be proven instead. That's kind of the point of the method. This reminds us of research. You can read this. There was a researcher named Solomon Asch. He talked about this in the 50s. He was talking about groupthink. You've probably seen this if you had to do a sociology course. He called it conformity to delusion. He said, basically, he was able to trick people into believing an experiment because of social pressure. That was kind of what he showed could happen with a group of researchers. And he said, but this cult has had a rather large advantage. We've had threatening of jobs, livelihoods, loss of income, education, social functions, loss of health maintenance, freedom of choice, loss of friends and family, etc. And the experiments that were done by Asch in the 1950s, they did not attempt to brainwash via repetition of memes and fear or censorship. It was actually very isolated. People in the Asch experiments were not bombarded with signs everywhere. Why do you think when you walk up to a storefront, depending on where you are, but there might be 4 of the same sign? Have you noticed that? I've seen that. There's 4 of the same sign. Now, that's not because necessarily it's some sort of massive plan. I'm not saying that, but it's because it's a cult. It began with a psychotic break, which was done on a massive scale that led to a psychosis of society, mass psychosis. And in order to deal with the mass psychosis, they've had to invent fictitious enemies and fictitious ways of beating these fictitious enemies that have no relation to reality. And they have to label, and because technically speaking, when you have the psychotic break, you're the one who's technically speaking out to lunch. So if you get called out on that, you either need to accept that or it's the reverse. No, you're the crazy one. I was talking to a family member today, and I said, did you know that they were doing things like locking people in regions and apartment buildings in Australia, and they weren't letting people in or out even if they were family, which conceivably could include children? And they said, where did you hear this? They weren't upset at me. They just said, where is this information? And I said, you have to look for it. They had no idea. This is not a stupid person. Just not even that obsessed with the news. Just if you don't look for it, you don't find it. One of the big problems too is that we've totally ruined by this. This cult has an advantage of creating this very dangerous binary thinking that now pervades society. Now, that means essentially, you're for or against, Democrat or Republican, anti-Trump or deplorable. Are you in this together or are you selfish? We were ready for this before this happened. Now, categories of political thought are useful. People will say, well, are you conservative? Well, yes, for obviously I believe the Bible is true and you should live that way. So sure, from the perspective of if you mean a conservative means a Christian man who essentially believes that the Christian values are true, then you should live that way, then that's what I am. But what does that mean for economics necessarily? What does that mean for, do I think that the red team or the blue team is better? I mean, in Canada, blue is conservative. They're no better than the red in Canada and vice versa. Could mean yes, could mean no. These labels don't work. There's much more to it than just, are you for this or against this? Well, I don't know about, do I have to be for or against this thing? If I don't use the ice bucket challenge, does that mean I'm against or for ALS? Again, we were primed for it. Nonsensical options such as wear a mask or make someone die, think about that, or take a jab or keep everyone in their gulag have also been at the forefront of the cult's binary mentality. Binary thinking is a trait of computers. This comes back to the fact that we spend all our time staring at things that are basically formulated by ones and zeros. Computers are based on 0 or 1, gap or fill, yes or no, etc. This is also the goal of brainwashing. Abstract thought is not a part of the process, and indeed logic and abstract reasoning are enemies of mind control. The problem is that the world functions 99.99% of the time in this large gray zone. Believe me, yes, we need more black and white when it comes to morality, but the problem is that we forget sometimes as right-wing Christian types is that black and white creates gray. Our author says to think that the world functions in a binary mode is delusional. What does it mean to be conservative? Well, in Canada, that means a different thing than America. In the UK, you could be a conservative anti-monarchist and a conservative monarchist. In America, if you were a conservative and you were pro-monarchy, you'd be anathema, traditionally speaking. In Canada, a conservative would be someone who might advocate for healthcare reform, but still thinks that universal payer systems are useful. Whereas in America, it's the opposite. I mean, if you're conservative, how dare you think of, Obamacare or whatever. I'm not saying that was a good policy. I'm just saying it doesn't fit. I don't even necessarily believe that I'm not even convinced that, for example, someone says, I hate to be that person and I'm as anti-jab as anyone, but my daughter, 27, got the flu after delivering her first baby, ended up in the ICU on a ventilator. You know what? I was in the hospital a couple years ago with walking pneumonia. If I had to let it go longer, I might have died. This is not me saying anything against. It's just the flu has this flu has a 99.98 whatever. If you're under the age of whatever, other flus are 99.9 whatever. Someone's going to die from one of these things. Ever since Adam and Eve sinned, we are going to die. At one point, we will all die. And in fact, they used to say, what's the two sure things are death and taxes? Taxes are more sure than death because you get taxed after you die now. All of us are going to die. Good news of the day. If you're in a state of grace, it's very good news. I know a guy who was from around here, was 40 years old. He dropped dead from pneumonia. This was 3 years ago. Walking pneumonia, dropped dead. Healthy guy. I don't know. I mean, this is not me. I'm not saying it's not, but then again, you have to ask yourself, what does this mean that if we're going to quote unquote take the virus seriously? And even then, this is just hypothetical to the person who said that. What kind of testing was used? It's a good question. I mean, we know that over a certain rate, it can be 90% false positive. It's totally possible that someone had a pneumonia that was really bad, tested positive for whatever, ticked off the test, and they labeled it that. But really the problem was pneumonia, which we've had forever. These are all problems that are huge. So anyway, someone else says, I knew a 40-year-old healthy dance instructor who died of the flu a few years ago. These things happen. And this is one of the major problems with this cult mentality. No, I'm not saying anyone in the chat has this, but I'm saying one of the major problems is that it's gotten rid of our ability to see things without getting emotional about it. Not saying that you've done that. I'm just saying this is something that's happened. Immunity does not mean free of pathogens, for example. There are people who have HIV but don't have AIDS. There are people who have Epstein-Barr but don't have mono. There are people who have influenza but don't experience the flu. Complicating matters is the fact that each and every pathogen or antigen has its own immunity scale for every single person. For example, one person may rarely suffer from the flu, but may suffer a summer cold or rhinovirus. My kids just had one of those, just little summer. It's a quick 24-hour cold that kids get in the summer all the time. Another person may rarely get that cold, but will be out of commission every year with the flu. Anyway, we could go on and on and on about the specifics. Everyone is going to encounter death at some point. Everyone is going to potentially get really sick from something. I'm 33 years old when I believe it was in 2019. It might have been 2018, but I think it was 2019. I was in the hospital with my two boys, and I had a bad pneumonia. It was a walking pneumonia. My kids, it was obvious. Poor little kid. I don't know if you've ever taken your kid to have an X-ray, a chest X-ray. They take their shirt off and they put them in this plastic thing, and this sounds funny, but they look like one of those chickens hanging in a Chinatown grocery store window. Patty asks a question. He's, I've heard that not all jabs use dead babies. Yes, not all of them do. There isn't one that's available that's not tainted by its testing, but they don't all use them in the actual formulation. Anyway, but I had walking pneumonia. I was sick for a couple weeks, and I just was like, the cold, the cough felt a little icy. But I wasn't going to go to the doctor except my kids were real sick, and I had to bring them. And I thought, well, I'm here, I might as well get checked out. They couldn't hear. They couldn't hear it on the stethoscope at all. Went to the X-ray and they said, wow, your lung is full of pneumonia. I could have survived without antibiotics. I mean, that's possible. I know, people, I mean, I know I didn't know as much as I do now. But the point is, I could have died as a 31-year-old man. Many have, historically. From something that I caught as a teacher. I caught a cold from one of my students. Got sick. Developed into a lung infection. Anyway, we're all going to die for some reason. And we don't know the reasons for a lot of this stuff, but we do know that it's a cult. It has all the aspects of a cult. So what's the way that we avoid this? Well, the way that we avoid this is we live in the truth. And how do we live in the truth? Well, you stay close to the faith. That's pretty simple. And one way that you can gauge whether or not you're living in the truth or not by staying close to the faith is think about all the responsibilities that you have. Think about all of the, let's call them, moral decisions you have to make in a day. That's what you have to focus on. I was talking to a lady earlier that she's going to be up for an interview on LifeSite. I'm putting it together. And her reason why in the beginning she realized that this was wrong was not because she had done any study into the virus, but because she said they're closing down the churches. That is not of God. Now, a couple weeks, sure, but she knew her church history and she said, they're closing down the churches. That's wrong. We need that to survive eternally. This can't be about health. That was her gut feeling just from a moral perspective. She knew it was wrong. And then eventually, she found the information, whatever. I knew from example, for me as a teacher, they were shutting down the schools. I worked very closely at the school I was at with kids who were very disadvantaged through coaching and through other volunteer activities. And I knew that they were going to go home to homes where they were having major issues that I won't speak about, but we're talking really legal issues, like bad stuff. And when they were going to close the schools, I said, are you nuts? I mean, schools, sure, the problems with curriculum, fine. I'm just saying, as a place where lots of kids get to go and escape the hell they live in, and you were going to take that away from them? That's criminal. It's criminal. There's no excuse. I realized then, I said, whatever this is, it's evil. Virus or not. It's the moral decision-making that we have to make. That keeps us close to the truth. Because if we're seeing things clearly from the metaphysical perspective of right and wrong, metaphysics governs physics. The natural law, the creative order that exists as a, what do you want to call it? A form of existence. That in and of itself has to be followed. Anyway, that's how we stay in the truth. So, thank you for joining me today on this live stream. We hope that we get the station back up. Pray for the Crusade channel. And that we can get that fixed back up. Go to crusadechannel.com/Kennedy. crusadechannel.com/Kennedy. I'll put the link in the description to sign up if you want to hear more of this. I had to censor myself a lot. It's weird. I'm used to be on the radio now. There was a lot of things I didn't get to say. Not swearing or anything like that, but just things that I knew it would get censored. Thank you for joining us. I hope we see you soon. Hopefully we'll be back up tomorrow. I think we're going to have a solution for the station tomorrow. We can have our regular programming, 3 to 5 Eastern Standard Time every day. Once again, that's at crusadechannel.com/Kennedy. I hope you have a good day. You've been listening to a free preview of the Kennedy Profession here on the Meaning of Catholic channel. This is a show where every day we try to make sense of, I say, lawless world using the natural law. That's what we try to do. I also recommend everyone goes to the Brownstone Institute's website. I believe it's called, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's just brownstone.org. Anyway, it's pretty good. Not all of it's perfectly in line with Catholic moral or philosophy or something. A lot of it's classic liberal ideas, but the critiques of what's been going on, this is the best place I found from a public policy perspective. It's the best, in my opinion. And check out LifeSite, where I write there a couple articles a day. And I'll talk to you all soon. Until next time, God bless.